of intro, and I just want to go over some of your responses on the Passover and Seder question, and then also answer some of your questions about the Leviticus reading. So let me just start off and talk about the Passover and the Seder, and a couple things I want you to see about the dynamic between the story as we get it in the Exodus telling and then the Seder. I really liked what Jordan Cooper said. I thought it was a neat formulation to think of the Passover. The Seder is a celebration of the Exodus. And I think that captures some of the relationship between these two things. We've got a story and then a ritual, right? And the Passover Seder is in a large way a communal celebration of that story. So clearly this story is central to Judaism, and it's a great story in itself, right? They make movies retelling some of the aspects of that Exodus story, but it has a high level of meaning, and that meaning is kind of drawn out through the ritual of the Seder. Thomas talked about he was surprised that the unleavened bread was mentioned right there in the text, and that's right. In Exodus 12, we get aspects of the ritual, kind of the basics of what would become the Passover celebration. And so you can see already in the biblical text, there's thinking about this is the central story for our community, and we are going to mark that story with some kind of an annual celebration, right? A ritual. And so you get some elements of that ritual are marked out, but at the same time, many things that we know about in the Passover Seder today aren't mentioned at all, right? So you can see there's been development of this ritual time. I don't think that if I just handed someone who didn't know anything about the Judaism or the Seder, the Exodus story, they would come up with something like the Seder, right? That's something that took long time to develop and had its own independent history. So it's tied to the story, but it's also not directly, not all its details aren't found and present in the Exodus story. Amy mentioned that she's now in her quarantine is staying with a Jewish family, and that one of the things that they talked about was in celebrating the Passover Seder is the extent to which there's kind of a new meaning to it as we're living through this quarantine situation. And I thought that was a great point and something that's really wonderful about religious texts. And perhaps also why religious texts are in story form instead of fact sheets about ways that we should think about the world or understand the world. These stories have numerous different applications and can be applied to, situations that no one could have imagined. And so I think that's a great example of what's so lasting and important about religious texts is the way they lend themselves to rethinking current situations. And that's a process that you would find in all religious texts. And certainly next week when we turn to the Ramayana, we'll see another example of that from an Indian tradition. And finally, Anne, you made a really great point about how lots of rituals, she mentioned Easter, but lots of rituals have at their basis some kind of a story. And that's kind of this broader point that I want everyone to come away with is the relationship between story and then ritual, right? That ritual are ways to underline, to make communally present and to highlight these important stories that lie at the basis of religious belief. All right. So we get, I think the Passover story in Exodus is a really good example of that interaction between story and ritual. And if you think about that in other contexts, I think you'll see it. Let me turn now to your questions about Leviticus. As I mentioned as I wrote legal portions of Exodus as well, but I was pleased that some of you seemed to kind of be fascinated by them. And in our time of the coronavirus and worries about purity and germs, I think these texts are worth going back to and thinking about how these kinds of regulations relate to religion. Alex, you had a question about skin disease, an odd passage in Exodus where it's talking about raw flesh and white flesh, and how if the person is completely covered with white flesh, then they can be clean again. And, to the one hand, this would be a little bit of a medical anthropology question and maybe something I don't know, but I think that maybe what you were missing as you look through that is the idea that white flesh, yes, it's disease, but it is a sign of being over the disease. It's kind of a remnant of the disease, whereas the raw flesh was the sign of the disease being kind of actively doing something bad to the flesh. So almost like a scab, that the white flesh was a sign that the disease had taken its ravages, but was not actively in an destroying, or it wasn't an open wound in the way that they seemed to be worried about. But this is a good example of the way this text moves out of what I would consider religious studies and into kind of this history of medicine, basically, right? And that's an interesting why are these included in this sacred text that we have. Jason, you talk about Jason and Nathan, you wonder about why some animals are included and not others. And we're going to read something about that when we look at Mary Douglas, Purity and Danger. She's going to have a whole chapter on her theory about why some animals, why not other animals. But there are some different paths that people have taken in answering that question. And one is that there's some kind of deep medical reason for these things, that they, disease, or there was known that pigs or this kind of shellfish cause problems and were dangerous if they weren't cooked right or whatever. And then there's this kind of, there's one view that says this was this ancient way of processing danger in different foods. And then there's more of a symbolic interpretation, which says there was something kind of symbolically not right or suspect about these different foods. And we will return to this when we get to that book, Purity and Danger. So I'm just kind of putting on a bookmark that that's where we're going to go to. Noah, you raise a really interesting question about the 10 Commandments, how you get to the 10 Commandments in Exodus. And then after that, you get to the Book of the Covenant, which is all these different rules and regulations. And that is interesting, isn't it? We think of the 10 Commandments as this summary of the law, but then there's this need immediately afterwards to go into all these other rules and regulations. And why is that? Maybe that's just a way to think about the 10 Commandments as these, some kind of the seed, the inner kind of a concise statement of values, but clearly those could be expanded with all these other smaller rules and regulations. Also, that we see another case of kind of mixing and mashing material from different time periods. That Book of the Covenant is very ancient, and with a lot, the closest parallels we have to some of those things in Exodus 21, 22 is in the Code of Hammurabi, this ancient legal text that we now know about, and that have a lot of similar things about if your ox gores your neighbor's ox and things like that. So those are this ancient book, and those are put up against what seems to be this very concise statement of morality in the 10 Commandments, which is even directly said to be directly from God. So I think they are kind of oddly juxtaposed, these two different ways of thinking about law. And I guess part of what I'm saying there is, that's a kind of attention to think about and to consider. And you're asking exactly the right question by noticing that juxtaposition. Thomas, you mentioned Leviticus as intense, and I'm glad you can see it that way. A lot of people don't enjoy reading Leviticus, but I think in a small section like we've got, it is pretty intense. Why does God care so much about the food and animals we eat? I would just point you to Exodus 11:44, where you can see some of the communal concern. One answer might be, oh, well, there's germs and there's problems. There's this old medical knowledge. But I would say Exodus 11:44, where it says, "For I am the Lord your God. Sanctify yourselves, therefore, and be holy, for I am holy. You shall not defile yourselves with any swarming creature," et cetera, et cetera. But there's this sense of community, and that being holy, being a pure community is somehow reflected in what animals and what foods are taken into this community. And I think if we think about our own current society, you'll think about a lot of ways in which there's guilt or unease about the foods that we take in and what makes us clean and impure as a community. And maybe we can learn to think of those things also as being a little more religious in orientation than we immediately think. Henry and Michael, you ask about slaves. And yeah, that ancient book of the covenant in Exodus absolutely contains rules for slaves that are within the community, the Israelite community. And those aren't servants, those are slaves. Now, that's not the kind of racial slavery that we associate with the American experience in the 18th, 19th centuries, but it is a slavery, and that's kind of is accepted as being a part of what's going on here in the Hebrew Bible. And this raises further questions about to what extent should we interpret these passages contextually, and to what extent are these timeless truths? Well, clearly, there's a lot here that has to be taken contextually, right? I don't think there's any religious tradition that exactly represents the way of thinking and the way of being that's in Leviticus. Every different tradition has ways of kind of modernizing and pushing things forward, and kind of leaving behind some things that seem particularly archaic in these Leviticus rules. But of course, there's a kind of picking and choosing that's involved in that. And so some of what Leviticus says, for example, about homosexuality will be kind of picked up and pushed forward as that's timeless, and we have to abide by that. But there's clearly lots of things about skin conditions and animals and health that nobody accepts or allows. And so this is clearly a very contextually and historically bound book. One more question, and I appreciated Ryan. You asked me, how do we push aside bias in our analysis of the Bible and religious texts? Well, it's difficult, right? So that's the first thing. But what I would urge everyone to do, and it'll get easier because the Ramayana might not be, even if you have a close connection in your path to the Bible, that probably won't be true about the Ramayana that we're going to get to next week. But step outside and think systematically about what it's saying. What does this say, not just about what I should do, what I want to do, what my tradition does, but what does this say about ritual, about the importance of story, about the connection between law and community? These are big questions. And if you can think about, this is one example of a community and a tradition, try to see it through someone's eyes besides your own, I guess is what I'm saying. And maybe I'll push a little bit on that when we talk about the Psalms on Wednesday, is how to step outside yourself and try to imagine these texts through a historical lens. All right. And that takes a lot of work. And so, Ryan, I appreciate your question. And I guess that's just something that I'm trying to push everybody to work on. See this, try to reimagine these texts. Even if you know the text, reimagine them and think about what they could have meant to another people in another time. Okay. I'm also going to put up a video introducing the book of Psalms.
Okay, can you stop for a second?
Yeah.